The announcement of the assignment traveled across the amphitheater like a pressure front, bending conversations and silencing the shuffle of boots as screens brightened above the circular tiers. The Galactic Academy of Survival Engineering preferred spectacle even when the lesson was simple, and the lesson on this rotation was disarmingly simple: create a trap and demonstrate it. The brief glowed across the central holosphere in crisp letters, while a low hum rose from the floor vents, and 1,000 small design ambitions woke up in the minds of cadets who had been waiting all term for a chance to prove that precision hardware and prestigious circuitry could outthink raw instinct. The Invigilator, a tall saurian with ceremonial sashes and an old scar along his left cranial ridge, finished the formalities with a measured voice and stepped aside so that the swarm of eager minds could get to work. On the lowest tier, where the light pooled and the air smelled faintly of ozone from the projectors, the human cadet sat with his hands folded, watching the flow of ideas rather than joining it. He listened to the soft clatter of styluses against tablet glass as crystal-bodied students drew net patterns that would diffract force and contain mass. He watched a pair of arachnid engineers sketch a tension lattice that would retract like a closing flower. He saw a serpentine strategist run a simulation of a magnetic corridor that would rip metal from belts and gravlocks and fling an intruder to the floor. Around him, classmates treated the word trap as an invitation to build a machine. He treated it as an invitation to read a mind. He knew why the Academy liked traps. A trap exposed posture. A trap asked a cadet to declare, without saying it, what frightened him most: chaos he could not calculate, or simplicity he could not respect. He did not move because movement would have looked like eagerness, and eagerness would have attracted unsolicited suggestions from the kind of cadet who mistook noise for proof. He had learned long before the Academy that a trap began before any object left a shelf. It began in the room, in the rhythm of footsteps, in the habits that repeated until someone thought a door would always open cleanly and a hallway would always be empty. He watched the door to the workroom the Academy had assigned to his cohort. He watched how the hinges complained at a certain angle and fell silent at another. He counted how often a judge entered without warning. He noticed that a junior instructor with a quick stride preferred to hook 2 fingers into the frame before swinging the panel wide, a reflex that left the top edge trembling for a breath. A trap, he thought, was a conversation with those tiny assurances that lived in a body, the unnoticed phrases a hand repeated when it reached for a handle or a foot repeated when it crossed a threshold. He remembered a cold night on a frontier station when power rationing forced his family to sleep in the cargo bay because the habitat's insulating foam had failed. He remembered how his sister, small and furious with the universe, tried to keep a group of opportunists from stealing their blankets by pushing crates into a maze that squealed when a brace shifted. The device was nothing. The sound was everything. It did not stop the thieves, but it built seconds where none existed, and seconds turned a frightened scramble into organized motion. He had carried that lesson into every corridor since. Traps could punish. Traps could also announce. He looked up at the holosphere again. The rubric demanded demonstration, safety, and repeatability. Nowhere did it demand elegance. Nowhere did it reward mass. He stood only when a row of cadets to his right began arguing about coil tolerances for a launcher that would loft a fiber mesh across an entrance. The argument produced heat and an air of competence. The mesh would work. It would also require a calibration phase that would stretch into an hour because one of those cadets prized perfection more than sufficiency. He walked past them and past a cluster of amphibious students who were printing adhesive pads for a wall-mounted snare. He stepped into the workroom and blinked as the light shifted from bright amphitheater white to utilitarian classroom gray. The place smelled like polymer dust and sealant. A bank of cabinets along the back wall held ordinary furniture for demonstrations that needed a stage: stools, tables, a podium, and a couple of chairs with scuffed feet and chipped paint along the rungs. He slid a chair out and set it near the door, not to use it yet, but to feel its mass and center. The wood was dense, probably a composite, heavier toward the backrest. He let his palms learn the balance. He tipped the chair forward and backward and found the point at which gravity became a whisper rather than a demand. He did not smile because he knew that self-satisfaction often arrived exactly when a plan went blind. He thought about leverage instead, about angles that turned a pound into a shout, and about how a doorway encoded the behavior of a person who believed he understood a room because he had permission to enter. Outside, the amphitheater continued to glow with projected innovation. A crystalline student demonstrated a floor of flexing facets that would swallow an intruder's foot and hold it like a patient mouth until security arrived. A trio of insectoid cadets unveiled a lure that used a tuned vibration to imitate a wounded animal, a strategy that would end in a blast of adhesive mist. Judges nodded, and a diplomatic instructor with cascading tendrils of light along her sleeves recorded notes. He watched her for a moment and decided she would not open a door with force. She would open it with consideration and a certain ceremony. The chair would not speak loudly to her. The junior instructor with the quick stride would be another matter. He imagined the evaluation flowchart the judges would use. An assistant would announce the next demonstration. An instructor would push the door. A panel would tilt. Metal would meet floor. Sound would perform the rest. That was the impulse that mattered, the lightning of surprise that bypassed training for a fraction of a second and exposed a body's first truth. A trap could fail to restrain and still succeed if it reset the mind of the intruder into caution and hesitation. He had learned that in a different classroom, smaller and poorer, where traps consisted of fishing line across a stairwell and an old kettle that would clatter when a door opened, waking a sleeping adult in time to turn on a light. He understood that many classmates had never needed sound because money bought silence as security. He was not ashamed of where he learned the opposite. He ran his fingers along the top edge of the door. The paint roughened near the corner, a signal that hands had favored that place. He noted the fasteners that held the hinge plates, counted the screws, and pressed the panel to feel the give. The door had spring and a slight rebound, perfect for a balance game that would reward the kind of confident entry the Academy praised in practice drills. He checked the ceiling for sprinklers and sensors. He checked the rule sheet for prohibitions and found only the usual warnings. No blades, no projectiles, no corrosives, no biological agents, no manipulations that would risk permanent damage or harm beyond controlled startle. He had no intention of earning a demerit for creativity. He had every intention of winning the thing that mattered to him, the admission, however grudging, that cleverness did not belong to expensive materials. He watched another team haul in a coil of smart wire that would tense itself around a mannequin when a trip pin popped. He admired the care and the sure hands and the synchronization as friends moved in polished concert. He had learned long ago that admiration did not prevent disagreement. He disagreed with the premise that a trap had to hold in order to teach. A trap could puncture assumption and then step aside while the person who lost the assumption argued with his own certainty. He returned to the chair and adjusted the balance again. He slid a length of thin cord from a utility kit and laid it against the door frame, not to secure anything yet, but to imagine how a stop line might keep the chair from falling all the way to the floor if an instructor already anxious about accidents tried to reduce the impact. He would not rely on the cord. He would rely on geometry. The geometry would say what he wanted it to say in the universal language of noise. He timed the foot traffic again. He watched the cadence of judges as they moved from station to station. He tracked where a dignitary paused to chat and where a junior took a detour for a fresh tablet stylus. He built a schedule in his head without calling it a schedule because naming a reflex sometimes made it rigid. The assessment would come soon. A small arc of attention began to bend toward the workroom door as word moved that the human cadet had collected only a chair, as if austerity itself were an insult. He had learned to live comfortably inside that kind of expectation. He let it settle over him like a blanket and breathed evenly. The amphitheater lights dimmed to signal a transition window. A chime rang, polite and soft, followed by the clipped cadence of an announcer who preferred to speak as if language could be stacked like bricks. The announcer invited observers to the workroom for a demonstration of a trap that, according to the submitted notes, required no power and no assembly time beyond 1 minute. A rustle ran through the crowd, the sound of attention narrowing. He lifted the chair not because he needed to, but because practice in front of witnesses calmed the small tremors that often accompanied a set piece that relied on balance. He found the angle again, felt the moment before toppling when an object held a breath, and decided that the door and he understood one another well enough to proceed. He did not worry about ridicule. He had brought worse things than laughter to heal. He did not worry about approval. Approval rarely taught him anything. He worried only about whether the first sound would coincide with the first step across the threshold, because the first step was where a person's weight committed to momentum, and momentum wrote a message in muscle quicker than any judge could write on a tablet. He wiped a smear of dust from the top edge of the door, took one step back to see the frame in full profile, and let his mind become quiet. The rest of the amphitheater continued to murmur its faith in instruments. He stood with a chair and a hinge and the oldest partner in survival, expectation waiting to be surprised. When the first cycle of demonstrations began, the amphitheater shifted into something closer to a theater of pride. Each alien cadet, certain of his or her brilliance, stepped forward with devices that gleamed under the sterile overhead light. The judges floated or marched to observe, their eyes and sensors recording details that would be tallied later. From his place near the workroom entrance, the human watched, silent, letting the parade of invention pass before him like a gallery of overcomplicated paintings. The crystalline student was first, his transparent limbs bending with fragile grace as he unveiled a floor trap of interlocking facets. Each panel shimmered faintly with energy, calibrated to flex just enough to trap a foot, but not enough to injure. He walked across the surface to demonstrate, and the trap snapped shut on his ankle with a precise hiss. The judges murmured approval at the engineering, while the cadet spread his arms in triumph. The design was flawless, but it had taken 2 full cycles of work to prepare. Next came the arachnid twins, their multiple arms weaving a lattice of silk-like filament that could fold into itself when an intruder stepped between anchor points. The demonstration was dramatic, the threads snapping forward to enclose a training mannequin in a cocoon. The instructors clapped their claws against the floor, impressed. Yet the mechanism left strands tangled and required a full reset. The twins whispered to each other nervously, clearly aware of the flaw but unwilling to admit it. The serpentine strategist slithered forward after them, his elongated body covered in metallic scales that reflected the room's light. He presented a magnetic snare built from compact coils strapped to the frame of a narrow corridor mock-up. As the mannequin was pushed inside, the coils pulsed and wrenched every scrap of metal from its surface, dropping the poor construct flat to the ground. Applause rose from the peers, but one of the judges frowned, pointing out the enormous energy drain. The strategist bowed nevertheless, unbothered by critique, his pride shielded by sheer confidence. Then came the insectoid triad, 3 cadets with mirrored movements and a single idea split between them. Their trap relied on vibration, a lure that imitated the distress call of a small creature. When activated, the chamber filled with a deep, unsettling hum that drew attention even from the audience. As the mannequin approached, adhesive mist burst from hidden vents, coating it in sticky foam. The judges leaned back, half impressed and half disgusted. The triad twitched their antennae with satisfaction. The human kept still throughout, his expression unreadable. The sound of chairs scraping across the amphitheater floor mixed with buzzing and hisses of energy. Every design sparkled with brilliance, and every creator basked in the brief recognition of the crowd. Yet beneath the spectacle, he noticed the same weakness repeating. Each trap demanded maintenance, power, or precision, that would falter under real pressure. He knew survival was rarely about perfect machinery. It was about what could be done quickly with what was at hand. As the cycle continued, whispers began to circle the tiers, whispers that carried his name. A tall, amphibious cadet tilted his scaled head toward a pier and asked why the human had not built anything yet. A cluster of crystalline observers laughed softly, suggesting that he would reveal nothing more than a rope and a stick. Even some of the judges leaned toward each other, curious, wondering if his notes about minimal preparation hinted at laziness rather than ingenuity. He heard it all and said nothing. He did not mind being underestimated. It was a shield sharper than any blade. One alien cadet, an Etherian whose body shimmered with pale light, approached him directly between demonstrations. Her voice echoed in harmonic tones as she asked if he planned to embarrass himself with something so small that the judges would laugh him out of the course. He met her glowing gaze without irritation, only calm acknowledgement, and gave no answer. The silence made her uncomfortable, and she withdrew, muttering about primitive minds. That reaction alone was enough for him. The attention of the room was no longer evenly distributed. A current of expectation, half mocking and half eager, bent toward the human's corner. The judges noticed the growing interest and exchanged glances. They had seen cadets fail before, and sometimes failure was as instructive as success. The human let the attention build around him like storm pressure, compressing air and thought. He had no need to rush, because every new contraption unveiled by his peers only deepened the contrast he intended to exploit. In a hall filled with power cells, filaments, magnetic fields, and adhesive clouds, his method would stand apart not because it was more advanced, but because it was the opposite. A trap, he understood, was not meant to dazzle engineers. It was meant to catch a living creature unprepared, to twist instinct against itself, to weaponize assumption. The more elaborate the design, the more predictable its failure once something unexpected occurred. The more humble the design, the more difficult it was to anticipate. He leaned against the cool wall and watched another group demonstrate an energy cage. The bars rose from the floor in a cage of blue light, surrounding the mannequin until it was immobilized. Applause thundered, but he knew the cost of the power draw could black out a small ship. He closed his eyes briefly and thought of his own plan, not with pride, but with certainty. He needed no applause. He only needed the sharp crack of a chair meeting the floor at the exact moment when an intruder crossed a threshold. That sound would do what no cage or filament could do, remind every living body of its own fragility, its own limits, its own vulnerability. The chapter of contrasts was closing. One by one, the elaborate creations ran their course, each more complex than the last, each less practical outside the laboratory. By the time the announcer's voice called for the final demonstration, a hush had fallen. Everyone was ready to see whether the human would confirm their derision or rewrite it entirely. He stood, slow and deliberate, feeling the weight of eyes upon him. He touched the chair once more to test the balance, then faced the door that had been waiting all along. The moment the announcer's voice faded, the amphitheater settled into an expectant silence that carried the weight of judgment. The human stepped into the workroom, the heavy chair in his grasp, and felt the change in atmosphere like a tide rising behind him. The other cadets leaned forward in their seats, eager to see him confirm the low expectations that had been whispered so freely. He ignored the stares, focusing instead on the small details of the environment before him. The door stood slightly ajar, its upper frame marked by the faint scuff of hands that had pushed it open in haste countless times. The hinges groaned faintly when tested, though not enough to compromise his plan. He ran his fingers along the edge once more, noting the imperfections, the roughness of chipped paint that would help grip the wood of the chair. In his mind, the trap had already taken shape, but precision mattered now more than ever. One misjudged angle would turn effectiveness into comedy, and though he did not fear ridicule, he preferred precision over spectacle. He lifted the chair by its worn legs, testing the balance once again. The weight was uneven, denser near the backrest. He shifted his hands slightly to accommodate the pull of gravity and practiced the placement in the air before committing. His movements were unhurried but deliberate, calculated to let the audience absorb every step. He knew their eyes were searching for some hidden complexity, a coil of wire or a concealed mechanism. The absence of such tools was part of the lesson. He tilted the chair forward and rested its top edge against the door frame. For a heartbeat, the object wavered, gravity pulling it toward the inevitable. He adjusted the angle carefully, setting it so that the balance point rested on the knife's edge between stability and collapse. The silence in the amphitheater deepened, tension coiling in the room as the cadets realized that this was not preparation for something more elaborate. This was the trap. A ripple of laughter broke from one corner, an insectoid cadet unable to contain his amusement. His mandibles clicked as he mocked the display, gesturing with exaggerated sweeps of his arms as if to show how childish it looked. The sound was quickly hushed by a crystalline peer, who preferred to see the demonstration play out before passing judgment. The human paid no attention. He leaned closer to the frame, running a cord discreetly along the edge, tying it in a loose knot to act as a limiter so the chair would not crash violently enough to damage the floor. It was not necessary, but it ensured the judges could not claim recklessness. Every motion was quiet, controlled, and exact. He stepped back and inspected the setup, his eyes narrowed slightly, his breathing even. At that moment, the door became the true stage. The trap itself was nothing more than a piece of furniture precariously balanced in expectation of movement. Yet the power of the trap lay not in its construction, but in its inevitability. The cadets realized this slowly, murmuring among themselves. Some scoffed, shaking their heads in disbelief, while others began to watch with a new unease. They understood instinctively that the moment the door opened, action would replace theory, and the sound of impact would echo louder than any clever mechanism. The judges observed in silence, their faces unreadable. One of them, the saurian with the scar along his cranial ridge, tilted his head slightly and narrowed his eyes, not in contempt, but in curiosity. He had seen countless contraptions over his tenure, but rarely something that challenged the idea of sophistication with such brutal simplicity. His hand lingered near the tablet, ready to record notes, though he did not yet write. The human adjusted the chair one final time, his fingers brushing along the rough wood, and stepped aside. His body language was calm, his shoulders squared but relaxed. He gave no explanation, no justification. Words would only dilute the effect. He knew that the next few moments would speak more eloquently than any lecture. The room shifted, the collective attention narrowing onto the door as though the entire amphitheater held its breath. An assistant, unaware of the setup, was summoned to enter the workroom for the formal evaluation. The human did not move, his eyes fixed on the door, his expression steady. He knew what would happen the instant the assistant pushed it open. To the audience, it was still a mystery, a game balanced on the edge of absurdity. For him, it was inevitability shaped into form. The door creaked as the assistant's hand pressed against it, the hinges releasing their faint protest. The chair trembled, gravity awakening, waiting to fulfill its role. For a fraction of a second, the amphitheater's air thickened with anticipation, the silence so dense it felt like a tangible force. The stage was set, the trap complete, and all that remained was the proof of its simplicity. In that suspended moment, before the fall, before the noise, the human allowed himself a brief exhale. It was not relief, but recognition. Every trap he had seen unveiled so far relied on brilliance that required constant supervision. His, in contrast, existed only in the certainty of natural law. Balance, gravity, sound. Forces that did not fail, forces that did not require calibration or fuel. He had set the stage, and the stage itself would deliver the lesson. The chair quivered, poised to teach a room full of skeptics what ingenuity truly meant. The hinges groaned, the assistant stepped forward, and the balance broke. The chair tipped in a swift, decisive arc, striking the floor with a crash that split the silence like a lightning strike. The sound ricocheted through the chamber, louder than any simulated hum or engineered snap the cadets had showcased earlier. For one raw second, the entire amphitheater recoiled as if the impact had threatened each listener directly. An insectoid cadet jerked backward, his limbs twitching instinctively. A crystalline student winced, his glassy surface vibrating with a pulse of alarm. The serpentine strategist's coils tensed, his body pulling into a defensive spiral. The noise carried weight, not just as sound, but as an undeniable truth. Something had happened that none of them had anticipated with such immediacy. The assistant froze mid-step, startled eyes wide, his hand still clutching the door. He glanced down at the fallen chair as though it had leapt to life on its own. His heartbeat, visible in the rapid motion of his chest, betrayed the momentary fear that had surged through him before thought caught up. He recovered, straightening his stance, but the damage had been done. For that brief flash of instinct, the assistant had been prey caught in the unknown. That was the essence of a trap, stripped of decoration and reduced to its core. The judges reacted next. The saurian with the scar leaned forward, his scaled hand tapping once against the tablet. His eyes glimmered with something close to approval, though his expression remained composed. Another judge, a luminous Etherian, tilted her head and let her body pulse with faint radiance, an unconscious signal of surprise. The others remained outwardly neutral, though subtle shifts, an exhaled breath, a narrowed gaze, betrayed the disruption that a single piece of falling wood had managed to cause. The cadets, however, could not hide their reaction so easily. Whispers broke out, scattered first, then multiplying into an uneasy chorus. Some tried to laugh, but the laughter was thin, forced, trembling at the edges. Others muttered about luck or cheap theatrics, though their voices carried the brittle timbre of those who had been shaken. A few, silent and thoughtful, stared not at the chair, but at the human, as though finally understanding what he had tried to demonstrate without words. The human himself did not move at first. He stood beside the door, arms at his sides, his face calm and untroubled. He had expected the sound, expected the startle, expected the rush of instinct through the room. What mattered now was not to bask in the moment, but to let it linger in silence, to allow the echo of impact to stretch into realization. Every trap was not just about the instant of activation, but about the seconds afterward, the way fear seeped into thought before discipline returned. He understood that timing perfectly. Only when the murmurs reached a steady rhythm did he step forward and reset the trap. He lifted the chair once more, tested its balance, and placed it back against the frame. The motion was smooth, unhurried, as though to prove that what had happened was not coincidence, but repeatable certainty. The assistant looked at him with a mix of unease and curiosity, uncertain whether to remain by the door or retreat from it entirely. The human gave no command, only adjusted the angle of the chair again and returned to his place beside the wall. The demonstration was complete, but repetition was its own form of emphasis. The announcer hesitated, unsure whether to close the session or to let the moment play out further. One of the judges spoke finally, his voice low but resonant, carrying across the hall. He acknowledged the simplicity of the device, but he noted the undeniable effect it had produced. He pointed out how every cadet in the room had reacted instinctively, how surprise itself had been weaponized. His words shifted the mood. Where mockery had threatened to rise, now contemplation replaced it. The cadets sat in uneasy silence, realizing that their elaborate machines, for all their brilliance, had not shaken the room the way a single chair had. The human listened, his expression unchanged. He knew that the true lesson was not in the judge's commentary, but in the memories seared into every witness. Each cadet would remember the moment when he or she flinched, the sound that bypassed intellect and reached into instinct. That memory would last longer than any technical schematic or complex blueprint. The assistant, still standing by the door, shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to open it again. The human noticed the hesitation and understood its value. A trap's purpose was not always to cause harm. Sometimes it was to change behavior, to plant doubt in an otherwise confident mind. Even a simple door had now become a threshold of caution. The entire amphitheater had watched as ordinary certainty was shattered by the crash of falling wood. That was a result no one could dismiss, no matter how much pride insisted otherwise. The judges marked their notes in silence, some quickly, some after long pauses. The audience sat without their earlier enthusiasm, subdued into quiet thought. The human let the silence remain, not filling it with explanation or boast. He had learned long ago that when a trap worked, the less said afterward, the stronger the lesson became. He left the chair where it was, still balanced, a quiet sentinel against arrogance. Then he stepped back into place, his task finished, the weight of proof no longer on his shoulders, but on the minds of those who had witnessed. The demonstration had been delivered not with wires, nor energy, nor adhesives, but with inevitability. And inevitability was a force no cadet could dismiss, because it existed outside of invention, embedded instead in the instincts that none of them could escape. In that truth, the human stood quietly, allowing the silence to teach longer than his words ever could. By the time the last reverberation died against the amphitheater's curved panels, the evaluation shifted from spectacle to accounting. The judges separated the noise of applause from the substance of effect, and the scoring rubric, designed for force, power draw, reset cost, and safety, met something it had not measured properly before. The saurian with the scar entered a quiet notation that adjusted a column no one had needed until now, a metric for involuntary response latency, the measurable gap between a confident stride and the instant a body remembered caution. The luminous Etherian recorded that the hazard profile remained minimal while the behavioral modulation remained maximal, a pairing seldom achieved by elaborate devices. Across the tiers, the cadets sat with the unusual stillness of a classroom that had been surprised into reflection, each learner privately inspecting the brief flinch that had betrayed the presence of an animal underneath training. The chair still leaned where he had reset it, the rope limiter barely visible along the frame, a plain object upgraded by context into an argument no one could easily counter. The debrief convened in a smaller chamber with sound-absorbing walls and a single hollow slab pulsing with the sequence of demonstrations. The crystalline students' interlocking facets rotated in perfect models, the arachnid twins' threads folded and unfolded in a loop, the serpentine strategist's corridor pulsed with magnetic arcs, the insectoid triad's adhesive plume blossomed and collapsed in silico. Last in the sequence, a door frame appeared with a simple annotation: gravitational topple, time to ingress, startle amplitude high, reset time low, collateral negligible. He watched in silence while the judges discussed lessons framed in courteous generalities. He knew the words would take time to travel into practice, because institutions preferred caution when a new idea felt too simple to be respectable. Still, the details were already shifting. The assistant who had opened the door took the far seat near the wall, his posture unconsciously avoiding proximity to any hinge or handle. The Etherian judge noted the phenomenon without stigma, calling it adaptive memory rather than embarrassment. The Saurian summarized the day with a phrase the Academy would keep, a sentence that treated a trap as a conversation that a room could have with a mind. He did not offer a speech. He answered only when precision demanded it. He described how he had inspected wear marks, listened to hinge complaints, and chosen an angle that let gravity do the work with repeatable reliability. He explained, with no flourish, that fear was not the goal. Recalibration was. A trap that made an intruder reconsider pace and posture had already achieved strategic advantage before any restraint occurred. He offered no drama in the telling, because the drama had already happened in the bodies that remembered their own flinch. A quiet settled over the table that acknowledged completeness. The judges dismissed the cohort for a short recovery interval and posted an addendum that surprised no one who had paid attention. An unscheduled follow-on scenario would test the class on securing a non-lethal perimeter in a residential wing, with priority on speed, resource scarcity, and behavioral effect. The corridor selected for the scenario ran like a spinal column through a cluster of dormitory modules, punctuated by service alcoves and a pair of intersecting hallways where sound behaved strangely. He arrived with a mixed team assigned by an administrator who assumed that pairing his minimalism with maximalists would force compromise. The arachnid twins still smelled faintly of adhesive mist. The serpentine strategist coiled with a focused calm that signaled competence but not humility. The crystalline student maintained an expression as smooth as his facets, but the pace of his blinks betrayed unease. The insectoid triad watched the ceiling vents as if expecting betrayal from above. He did not command. He walked the length of the corridor once, palms grazing the wall for seams, eyes marking scuffs near knee height where boots had brushed concrete, ears counting an odd flutter near a junction where air pulsed in 34-beat cycles. He had learned to read halls the way others read code. He chose points, not equipment. He scavenged a handful of dull objects from a storage cabinet. 2 cracked cups, a length of frayed cord, a pocket full of metal fasteners, a roll of tape that had seen better days, a single bent hanger abandoned by someone who had never returned for it. He placed the cups lip down on a shelf above head height at the first intersection, poised where a casual shoulder would bump them free into a cascade loud enough to announce motion without wounding pride. He taped the frayed cord across a service alcove at ankle level, slackened just enough to catch on boots without tripping, the line positioned not to punish, but to force a step to hesitate and reset. He used the bent hanger as a soft strike against a vent cover, tuned so a brush of airflow would rattle it with a metallic whisper distinct from the corridor's usual breath. He scattered a thumb-width strip of fasteners near a high-traffic corner, not to harm, but to seed a field of tiny clicks that would violate confidence with each step. He left the tape mostly unused, reserving it to seal a single door seam at the far end, just enough to ask a hand to work harder, stealing seconds that mattered. The arachnid twins watched the arrangement build, confusion gradually turning into careful interest. The serpentine strategist said nothing, but his coils unspooled enough to suggest acceptance. The crystalline student volunteered a small reflective tile from his kit without words, and he affixed it to a low wall opposite a light strip so that a moving silhouette would flash once before the owner noticed, the oldest signal in the world reminding muscles that something existed outside the fovea. He posted the insectoid triad as observers at 2 angles where their keen antennae could feel perturbations the rest of the team would miss. He invited participation without asking for permission, and in doing so he lowered the heat that often boiled off from bruised egos. The perimeter took shape like a sentence everyone had learned to read in a first language he had remembered while others had forgotten. The red team test began without fanfare. 2 stealth drones and a pair of cadets designated as intruders moved from the opposite end with a remit to breach, bypass, and tag a target room. Within a time limit the Academy thought generous. The drones were quiet in the way disciplined threats were quiet. The first passed the reflective tile and stuttered, an algorithm deciding whether the flash meant motion behind it. The hesitation cost 2 seconds. The companion drone clipped the tuned hanger at the vent, and the metal whispered a note no machine enjoyed hearing. The intruding cadet behind the drones hesitated as the cups at the intersection toppled and clattered, the sound bouncing and multiplying until location became ambiguous. A step slowed at the slack cord, then reset with a careful lift rather than a confident stride. The fasteners made an irregular crunch that no training program had taught the intruder to ignore. By the time the pair reached the sealed seam at the far door, the limit had expired. No one had been harmed, and nothing had been destroyed. Yet a perimeter barely more complex than a list of nouns had defeated a team built on speed. He marked observations without glee. He noted where the sound had been too subtle, where the chord's slack had been imperfect, where a more skilled opponent would have adapted. He invited the arachnid twins to retune the chord with filament precision and watched them work with an eagerness not present earlier. He asked the crystalline student to adjust the tile's angle for a fainter, more insistent flash, and admired his uncomplaining adjustments. He asked the serpentine strategist to find an airflow irregularity and smiled inwardly when the coil master mapped a pressure wave with elegant economy, proving that simplicity did not require abandoning sophistication. The insectoid triad proposed a dry leaf from a decorative plant as a different kind of whisper, and he accepted it, because humility meant learning from anyone who offered a better rattle. The post-scenario debrief wrote the rest. The Academy issued an addendum to the course doctrine that defined a trap not as a device that restrains, but as an arrangement that converts expectation into cost. The rubric acquired a formal surprise index, a measure not for cruelty, but for brain-to-body lag under sudden stimulus. Reset time received a weighting that outscored raw holding power when mission profiles prioritized mobility. The safety clause gained an example of excellence under minimal risk with maximal behavioral outcome. The footnote credited the demonstration to a Terran cadet by cohort and number with no flourish, because the Academy preferred sobriety in its documents even when the original moment had been loud. Back in the workroom, he returned the chair to its rack, wiping dust from its legs with a rag he found in a drawer. He ran a thumb across the door's top edge one last time, then drew a small chalk line at the place where balance had turned into inevitability, a mark that meant nothing to anyone who had not been present, and everything to anyone who had. He closed the door gently and listened to the hinge breathe without complaint. The amphitheater's glow had softened to the dusk hue the Academy used in late cycles. He walked the corridor with the easy gait of someone whose argument had been made and accepted, not with triumph, but with the lighter step that followed responsibility met and completed. He did not collect praise from peers who now watched him without irony, and he did not seek apology from those who had mocked him. The lesson had struck harder than any sentence could. The next rotation's syllabus reflected the change. An early module introduced friction traps and sound cues before power snares and energy cages, and a practical lab encouraged students to walk a hallway in borrowed boots while trying not to make a single unintended sound. The Etherian judge scheduled a seminar on cognitive startle and recovery, referencing studies that measured heart rate variability during minimal threat stimulus as a predictor of decision quality under pressure. The Saurian updated the assessment to accept solutions that began with inventory rather than requisition. In one quiet corner of the library, a short case study described a chair, a door, and a bruise applied to pride that healed into wisdom. His name appeared once, small and precise, enough to mark history without turning it into a shrine. He left the building as the station's false sunset rolled along the habitat ring, casting long rectangles of light across the floor. He passed a maintenance worker adjusting a squeaky latch and nodded once in instinctive respect. He paused at a viewport that looked over the docking spine where ships moved like thoughtful animals, entering and leaving a sleepless nest. He pressed a palm to cool glass and felt that the day had completed a circuit that began long before the Academy ever knew his name, in rooms where noise had been the only ally his family could afford. He did not call the journey poetic. He called it practice. In the weeks that followed, cadets from species he had barely spoken to before began asking, in careful, pride-protecting ways, to walk with him during setup hours, to talk about angles, to listen to hinges, to notice where paint wore down at thumb height. He never refused. The knowledge cost him nothing to share and cost others only the price of shedding ornament in favor of function. When the term closed, the Academy adopted a single-sentence amendment to the Survival Engineering Charter that read, in essence, that the simplest reliable arrangement that alters hostile behavior is superior to a complex, unreliable mechanism that promises dominance. He read it once and nodded, satisfied not because it credited him, but because it would outlast him. He filed his kit, straightened a chair as he passed, and walked down a corridor that would always hold a memory of a sound that turned certainty into caution and caution into understanding. He did not look back. He did not need to. The door had already taught the lesson, and the lesson had closed behind him with a soft, ordinary click that meant the world understood something new.